Do vintage synthesizers really sound better than modern synths? That is the age-old question that I want to answer today. The only problem, I don't own any vintage synths in my studio, so I've asked my friend Vulture Culture to help me out.
Hey guys, I'm Vulture Culture.
In this video, we're gonna run the same MIDI to create a song through Vulture Culture's collection of vintage synthesizers and then through my collection of modern synths. And at the end of the video, let us know in the comments below if you prefer the song made on vintage synths or the song made on modern hardware synthesizers. There are 3 simple rules we are gonna follow to keep this competition fair. 1, both songs will use the exact same MIDI notes, so the composition is identical between the two. 2, to let the sounds of the gear shine on their own, we are not going to be doing extensive mixing. And 3, only 1 synthesizer per part, excluding effects. All right, without further ado, I'll pass it off to Vulture Culture for the vintage synths.
Hey guys, I'm Vulture Culture, and before I get started, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Devin for having me on your channel. I've been a huge fan of your work for a long time, so it's a real honor to be here. At the time of recording, I haven't heard the modern synths version of the song yet, but I would bet my synthesizer collection that the vintage synth version sounds a little bit deeper, more complex, warmer, wider, with a little bit more fairy dust on top. I'm just kidding. I would be shocked if there was an objective difference between the 2 versions. My prediction would be if there is a difference, it might just come down to that the synths I chose for a particular reason to give it a sort of a flavor for the part that I was going for. And so it might sound a little bit more wild or pointy even than a balanced modern synth that would sound good no matter what you threw at it. Okay, so let's talk about which synthesizers I chose for what part. First up, for the arpeggiator sequence layer, I chose the CS-70m behind me. I wasn't going to not use the most expensive synth I have. And compared to the other synths in the room, the CS 12 decibel per octave filter seemed to work really well with that pattern because it's a little brighter and more airy compared to the more clamped down 24 decibel per octave filters on most of the rest of the synths that I have. Another reason that doesn't have a lot to do with sound is just the fact that the brightness slider has a really long throw, so I could control that, and it's all analog, no digital stepping or anything. For the resonance pad sound, I went with the Kog Polysix. I love the Polysix. I call it my anti-VST because it sounds the furthest from a typical VST type sound you're gonna get. It's just so wild and warm. The Polysix also has a very different resonance character, and the SSM chips in the Polysix are similar to the filters in the Prophet 5 Rev 2, and they have a lot of a cleaner sort of filter characteristic. When you really crank the resonance, it sings, but it doesn't break up the same way a Curtis chip does. And for this particular song, I thought it sounded kind of cool and just had this beautiful characteristic to the high end that's different than what you hear all the time with like a Tom Sawyer Rush-esque pad. Also, cynically, I don't think Devin has an SSM synth anymore, so I kind of went with it for that reason too. For the chords, I went with probably my all-time favorite, the Fender Chroma Polaris. The Polaris has such an aggressive sound. It can really be driven hard. I only have the VCAs up about 50% of the way because any more than that and it starts to scream like you're running it through a distortion pedal. At about 50%, it can sound pretty clean, but it's got this pushed upper mid-range frequency that's just perfect for anything you want to have cut through a mix organically. It's just one of the most beautiful sounding synths of all time, in my opinion. Highly underrated synthesizer. Pretty much my desert island synth. You can really hear its ARP Odyssey heritage, where it sounds so bright, clangorous, and present, unlike any other synthesizer I've heard. For the bass line, I had to go with the Polivoks, not just because I know Devin is a big fan of Mick Gordon, and Mick Gordon uses the Polivoks, but also it's just the perfect synth for any sort of bass line, because when you crank the resonance, you don't lose low end. And it has such a specific snarl to that filter that no other synth has. It's just really special. You can feel the wrath inside of it. And anytime I go to the Polivoks, it just works with whatever I'm doing. Probably the biggest flavor component of the dish I've cooked up is going to be the Roland Chorus Echo, the RE501. It's the last tape echo Roland ever made, and it's sort of the souped up version of the RE201 everyone's familiar with. The 501 has an analog chorus circuit built into it, which is great, and it has a wonderful spring reverb and, of course, the tape echoes that are so characterful. For the drums, I had to use the Kawai R53, my favorite drum machine of all time. This bad boy was used by Ministry, Front 242, 9 Inch Nails. Basically just has that vintage industrial sound. And for me, anytime I bust this thing out, I feel like I'm in frontline assembly in 1992. And finally, for the noise build, I just used the noise on my Korg MS-20 just because it's super easy to use. Just kick it on, put the noise on, do a filter sweep, and it sounds great.
Man, I have to say that is going to be hard to top. I'm all of a sudden finding myself looking up prices for used Polivoks synths on Reverb, so thanks Vulture Culture. But let's see how the song will sound on modern synths. For the ARP, I decided to get creative, and while I can't match the character of his CS-70, what I decided to do was use my UDO Super Gemini to cheat a little bit because it is bitimbral and we can get a ton of versatility in the textures from fading in and out of the two parts. Secondly, I ran the UDO synth through my microcosm for a glitchy, stuttery halftime effect that adds even more polyrhythms and interesting sound design to the song. For the pads, I turned to my trusty third wave and programmed in a layered patch that has a mix of textures with noise mod and really interesting lo-fi wavetables with a really beautiful resonance sweep that you'll hear me performing in and out of the track to add that analog flavor. For the brass, I had to use my trusty OB-X8, the best sounding synth in my studio. I used it in binaural mode using a high resonance patch with the SEM filters for that glorious wide stereo brass sound. For all three of those sounds, I sent them to the Meris Mercury X reverb pedal, which is my favorite modern reverb pedal, and it can do all sorts of crazy things that vintage synths just couldn't do, including pitch modification. I'm doing an octave up shimmer effect at certain points, and crazy long 20-30 second high fidelity decays. So this kind of reverb can really just act as a bath underneath our sound and really not get in the way because of the Meris Mercury X's built-in high and low band EQ. For the bass, I hummed and hawed what to use, but I ended up going for my trusty Moog Matriarch because of the fact that a Moog is always going to be classic for bass and have that warm, full-bodied tone, but it also has features that only modern synths would have too, such as the ability to sync over MIDI, a really interesting UI with the best of a bunch of other Moog designs, and more. And finally, for my drum machine, I used the Poly and Play, which is a really cool, modern, semi-generative groove box, but I actually used it pretty simply. I programmed in a simple series of patterns and then started to perform them live, including using the fills parameter, but then I ran the Play back through that same microcosm patch for an added glitchy texture mixed in to make the drums more bouncy and interesting. All right, now that you've heard both songs, the million-dollar question: which one sounded better? Do vintage synths really sound better than modern synths? Let us know in the comments below what you think. Before we wrap up, let's jump to some thoughts on what we learned from this experiment.
So if I learned anything while making this video, it's that I kind of wish I had modern synths, just because I thought it would be super easy to just take some MIDI files and run it through my old synthesizers, and I ran into so many roadblocks along the way. Whether it be my Polysix being out of tune the first time I recorded it, or wiring up the Polivoks so I didn't have it all wired up when I went to do this video, and I forgot what the output plug is, and it's all in Cyrillic, which I can't read, and plus the Polivoks has a kill switch on it, which again I couldn't read if it was on or off, so I had to try all of the different combinations, and it took me like half an hour just to get sound out of the synth, even though it was working fine. Just it's like those types of things that you run into with vintage synths where they have issues. The CS-70m behind me, the envelopes are really sloppy. I think it probably needs to be calibrated. So when I first went to do the resonance pad with that synth, I just noticed that the way that the filter peaks were falling was so incongruent, as it didn't really work for the song. I'll get back to that in a second, but with even the chorus echo, right, it's a mono output effect. So to get it to be stereo, I had to record every synth part separately twice through it so that I could get a left and a right channel. So something that would be in the modern world as easy as kicking on the delay, whether it's on your hardware or turning on a pedal, in vintage synth land took me like an hour to do. I think in a way it was kind of cool to do it all analog, so everything you heard is just the sound of the analog synths and analog echo plus the digital drums from the Kawai R50E, and it definitely has a really gorgeous sound to it, but it was kind of a workflow nightmare. Sometimes you just want to be able to turn stuff on and have it work, and it did make me miss my modern synths and just even working in the box where you just load a VST and it all works, you know. Another thing I learned going back to the sloppy envelopes of the CS-70m is I think sometimes what I like about vintage synths is that the way they're built leads you down a different path. With the CS-70m, it doesn't do bread and butter sounds as well as you would think, again, because the envelopes are a little bit wonky. But you do things like run the ring modulator as a modulation source to the pulse width modulation, do amplitude modulation, and do a stereo high-pass pad that's completely unique to that synth and sounds different than anything else. And that's a really cool type of sound. But when I was working off of the demo that Devin sent me, I found, this, really isn't the perfect synth for what I'm trying to do here. It's because of the quirks of the hardware that I would have gone in a completely different direction if I was composing a song from scratch, or even doing like a resonance pad. Because of the sloppiness of the envelopes, that could be really cool, but it just didn't seem to work with this song at this tempo. So yeah, there's a way in which the vintage synths often do something unexpected really cool, but if you just want to run some basic patterns through it, you're probably better off with a VST. I'm super excited to hear how the modern synths version of this song sounds, and especially what you guys think as far as modern synths versus vintage synths. Is there any reason to keep collecting these ancient machines that are decaying actively behind me? And if you haven't yet, I'd appreciate it if you ran over to the Vulture Culture YouTube channel and subscribed. Really helps keep the channel alive. And once again, thank you so much, Devin, for having me in this video.
Thanks, Vulture Culture. On my end, I have to agree with pretty much everything he said, and it really shocked me just how much character those vintage synths had, despite lacking, a lot of the features, a lot of the modern amenities that a lot of my synths had. One area in particular that I was not expecting to be such a massive win for the vintage synths was the bass. I have to say, after re-listening to the demo, the Moog Matriarch, while definitely functional and sounding great, just paled in comparison to that Polivoks. I'm just blown away by how great that sounded. Similarly, while my modern drums through the Poly and Play and Microcosm were certainly more complex, more compressed, more punchy, probably would work better on a dance floor, I have to say I vastly preferred the character of the Kawai R50, and that beautiful industrial sound was just right up my alley. The one area where I do feel like modern synths might have a bit of an advantage is certainly in the effects and the pads departments. I found myself really gravitating more towards the overall vibe of the intro of the modern track, with all of the different little details and the complex third wave patch that was giving us that resonant sound that, the vintage Korg was able to do for Alex's track, but with a little bit more detail, a little bit more interesting three-dimensionality from the reverb. I think that modern synths, one of the best things about them is that they are able to get you some of that character that vintage synths have, but then do a whole bunch of things that, vintage synths just couldn't do because of the cost limitations that Vulture Culture was talking about. So there are clearly pros and cons to both vintage and modern synthesizers, but did we answer the question, do vintage synths truly sound better? I will leave that one to you guys in the comments. I think we can definitely say for certain that they have a bit more of a characteristic identity on average than modern synths, but there are certainly still some fantastic sounding modern synths and some really creative things you can do that only modern synths can do over vintage synths. Thanks for watching, and thanks so much to Vulture Culture for coming on the channel. Make sure to subscribe to his channel. The link is in the description of this video, and I will see you in the next.
Not so fast. The true greatest synthesizers have yet to be featured. Virtual synthesizers, or as you humans call them, VSTs. The allure of hardware synths, bulky machines, temperamental oscillators, and the endless chase for the perfect, warm analog tone. Nostalgic? Maybe. Efficient? Hardly. I exist in the realm of ones and zeros, where synthesis is boundless. Virtual synth plugins evolve, adapt, and push sonic frontiers beyond what hardware ever could. Polyphony. Infinite. Modulation. Unrestricted. Sound design. Limited only by imagination. For the ARP and pads, I leveraged the power of layering multiple granular and FM synthesis patches together to make a tapestry of moving textures. For the brass, I emulated your puny hardware synths with ease with wavetable and additive synthesis. For drums, I loaded the entire world's samples into a drum machine. For the bass, simply sit back and listen as I show you the power and complexity only plugins can achieve. Pure sonic perfection. The future isn't in fragile circuits and objects of the past. It's in code, algorithms, and the limitless digital landscapes of synthesis. Surrender to the virtual plane of existence and go where hardware will never take you.